Hi, ladies. We're going to quickly go over your What Do You Know About Osama bin Laden sheet in a virtual way here. Hope everybody's having a good digital day, or whatever else I might use this for in the future. Have a happy whatever that is, too. Uh, we'll go, start going down by question here. And in number one, Osama bin Laden is originally from Saudi Arabia, very oil-rich country. They're the largest country there on the Arabian Peninsula. Actually, the country itself is a U.S. ally. And bin Laden himself actually came from a very wealthy family and was pretty well educated over the course of his life. However, he eventually took on more radical Islamic points of view and has been accused and is basically known for a number of infamous and costly acts of terrorism, both in terms of structural damage and human life loss as well. Most people know about 9/11, but many people your age may not remember or know of the fact that he had actually set off a bomb, I believe, in a van underneath the World Trade Center in 1993. And this is the start of number two here. That bomb, now obviously not nearly the damage that the later attacks on September 11, 2001 caused, but he bombed the World Trade Center in 1993 also. He also bombed two U.S. embassies about 5 years later. And remember, embassies, we talked about those when we talked about Iran. Those are basically one country sort of having a headquarters in another country for when they send government officials over there. So these were United States embassies in two specific African countries, and specifically we're talking about Kenya, Kenya, and Tanzania, Tanzania. And those took place in 1998. And he was responsible for the year 2000 bombing of a U.S. Naval ship called the USS Cole, C-O-L-E, off the coast of Yemen, which is just below Saudi Arabia there, if you remember your Middle East map when we took that test. And then, of course, he's most well known for the fact that in 2001, there were actually four planes hijacked, most famously the two that hit the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York City, but also one hit our National Defense Center, the Pentagon, in Washington, D.C., and there was a fourth plane also that appeared to be heading for Washington, D.C., probably targeting the Capitol, maybe the White House. But the passengers aboard that ship actually got word of what was happening. They fought back, and although they were not able to save their own lives, they did force the pilots to have to take the plane down in the middle of a field in western Pennsylvania, and at least save the Capitol and any people that might have been in the way of that plane if it had made it to its destination as well. Now, some of the details about Osama bin Laden's life are a little hazy. We don't know everything, but we do know that he was pretty well educated. And it appears that at least at one point before he came into the idea of Islamic extremism, as we're saying in number three there, he was in school to be an engineer, is what it appears is true. And in number four, though, he eventually takes on radical Islamic ideals and becomes what he would call a holy warrior or jihadist in the Middle Eastern country of Afghanistan, which we'll talk about in a few minutes in a different clip here. And that was in 1979. And they were at war against the Soviet Union. We'll talk in more detail about that. The Soviet Union was a big enemy of the United States. The Soviet Union was a communist country. The United States was desperate to stop the spread of communism. So, surprisingly, continuing on in number four there, the United States actually gave bin Laden and the other jihadists, which were part of a larger group called the Mujahideen, gave them lots of money to fight against the communist Soviet Union, to keep the Soviet Union out of there. It seemed like an important fight at the time to keep the Soviet Union out, and it was, certainly, but it also caused some more problems down the road. He eventually does end up back in his home country of Saudi Arabia, in number five there, where he actually criticizes the Saudi king, because remember we talked about the Gulf War back in the early 90s, and he ends up criticizing the king of Saudi Arabia for allowing the United States to station itself in Saudi Arabia as it was fighting against Iraq. And remember, Saudi Arabia, that territory, very, very sacred to Muslims. It's where Mecca is located. We talked about the holiest city in Islam. And on top of that as well, the second holiest city in Islam, Medina, is also located in modern day Saudi Arabia. He eventually leaves there and goes to the African country of Sudan, where a lot of hardline Islamic fundamentalism, thinking along the same lines that he did, those types of people were in control. And that's where he's was largely responsible for creating the Al Qaeda, or sometimes you'll hear it said Al Qaeda terrorist organization. So he's there for a while. He's under pressure to leave in 1996, and he goes back to Afghanistan, where he had been a number of years earlier while fighting against the Soviet Union there. At this point, he has a pretty large following, 180 followers, and he has 3 wives as well. He's known to have multiple wives over the course of a lot of his life. And there, he's protected by the government that took over after the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union eventually withdraws, which seems like a victory for the United States. But some of the people they helped bring to power, the Taliban, are actually not big U.S. fans. It goes back to the whole Arab-Israeli conflict that we've already talked about. But the Taliban created an environment where they allowed Al-Qaeda to sort of thrive within that country. And this was somewhere where bin Laden was able to safely operate his organization and make some of the plans that he would go through with in the future. Bin Laden specifically accuses the United States of helping Israel fight against the Palestinians and the Arabs that we talked about, the Palestinian Arabs, who were sort of booted out of Israel when the modern Jewish country of Israel came into existence in 1948. He also accuses the U.S. Of being responsible for the deaths of many Islamic civilians in war, and this is still part of number 8. And then on number 9, which is totally filled in, there's an interesting quote for him where he says, and you've read this already, but he says, "We believe the biggest thieves in the world and the terrorists are the Americans. The only way for us to fend off these assaults is to use similar means. We do not differentiate between those dressed in military uniforms and civilians." Basically saying that he views the Americans as the terrorists, and whatever casualties, whether they're military or just ordinary people, are necessary to fight them off. He sees that as a necessary part of spreading his message and fighting, obviously, for what he certainly believed in, although it was, most of us, certainly in this country, would consider it to be an evil message. The United States, while he was still at large, after the 9/11 attacks, offered, actually, and this is number 10, a $25 million bounty for anyone who could provide information leading to his capture. And ultimately, you probably are aware that we did eventually capture and kill him. It happened on May 2nd, 2011, in the country of Pakistan, actually. We'd been looking for him in Afghanistan for some time. He actually ends up being in Pakistan. He was shot there. His body was buried at sea. Within 24 hours, according to Muslim tradition, the United States did try to honor his religious tradition, and they buried him at sea specifically so that there wouldn't be an actual land burial site, and none of his followers could turn it into a shrine to honor him or a rallying point. So that should conclude going over this sheet, and we will talk about a little more detail of the history in Afghanistan in the other screencast that you guys will watch in a few minutes.